and I want to go over a few things before we start. Our subject for today is building a strategy, how learning and development drives business value. And we want to make sure that everybody can participate. So as you log into WebEx, there is a chat box on your right-hand side. If you could go ahead and type in the message, if you have any questions, have any technical challenges, certainly we're here to help you out. But in addition, throughout the session, we will be providing some questions and some opportunities to interact. So my name is Laura Riskus, and I am your host for today. However, we have two fantastic presenters here today to present our strategy session. I'm going to turn it over to Ray Valenzuela, who is the VP of Strategy for Kavia Learning. Ray, welcome today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for the great introduction to us, this exciting topic that we have today. And also let me welcome everybody on the line today and everybody that's going to be hearing this later on the recording. So we get to talk about a very exciting topic today, building a strategy, how to take learning and development, the efforts we do around learning and development, and really link that to business value and what we do. And before we get into really the purpose of this webinar, and all of the exciting things that we get to talk about that really encompass this topic as a whole, I'd like to also introduce a very exciting co-presenter that we're going to have today. So joining me on the line today to talk about a lot of these exciting topics is Steve Jenkins from Boeing. So Steve, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ray. My name is Steve Jenkins. I work for the Boeing Company. For the past few years, I've led a learning management team, a team of learning scientists. And our responsibilities were developing an enterprise learning strategy as well as enterprise learning architecture and the enabling processes that go with it, as well as leading a project management office.
Thank you much. So exciting. Let's jump right into the topics that we're going to have today. So why are we all here and what are we trying to talk about? Really what this boils down to is we are really talking about the business of learning and how strategy helps us as learning and development professionals really drive value for the organization. And as we kind of worked with this across the industry and seen this in different organizations in different places, we realized some of the same questions have been rising to the top. Some of the simple things like what is strategy, what does it do for an organization, and how do we do it well? And really, what is the true cost of learning? Why should we care so much about thinking strategically and what it does from us? I think really the biggest thing and the most exciting part of the topic that we're going to cover today really revolves around shifting our way of thinking about learning and development as a whole. And really I would summarize that as moving away from tactical thinking. And we'll talk a little bit about how we would define tactical thinking and what we've seen in the industry, and also different ways, tips, and techniques that we can move beyond the tactical thinking into the more strategic efforts that the industry as a whole is moving towards. And then last but not least, we really want to drive some value. So hopefully everybody on this call and everybody who hears this later can take the 7 tips that we'll share at the end of this and really take it back to the business and rethink or improve, or maybe not even improve, but help bolster some of the strategic work that they're doing there. So on all, that's their agenda. And if I could summarize what we're trying to accomplish today in really one sentence, it's how to build strategies that connect talent and development efforts with the needs of the business. So let's start us off right off the bat by talking about why do we even need strategy in the first place? So what is strategy and what does strategy do for us? So as we see it, the role of strategy is really to connect those talent development activities strategically to the objectives and goals and the decisions of the business as a whole. So if I step back from that statement and add a little bit of clarity to what that means, really what it is saying, what are we doing that is driving value for the business? How are we equipping and empowering our talent to be successful in the same direction with the same momentum that the company as a whole wants? So are we doing things that helps the business, or are we doing things that help the current situation? And oftentimes they may be the same or they may be different. Really, some of the things that we think about here is how do we drive our company's goals through learning and development, and not just through training and random training efforts. We want to think about how we take things and encompass that in a way that not only are we equipping and empowering talent, but we're giving them skills that they can succeed in the long term and not the short term. And this is becoming more and more important for the organizations. But don't take my word for it. I'll kick this over to Steve, and he can talk a little bit about his experience from his side.
Thanks, Ray. Whether you work in a large enterprise with multiple organizations or a smaller company with maybe just a couple of organizations, one of the things that companies will do is locally optimize their training, saying, okay, we know this better than anybody else, so we have to be in charge of this. And when you do that, you miss out on an overall strategy, like Ray says, tied to talent development, and more importantly, bringing business value in developing talent or learning for business value. One of the things that we saw within Boeing was that there were several redundant, very well established learning organizations, and we're going through a transformation now where we're not necessarily going to centralize everything, but we want to enact a one Boeing learning ecosystem that drives, that all aligns with a enterprise strategy. So that's what Ray is referring to when he says an overall top-level strategy, not just someone fell down, so we need a new safety and health course. We need a new ethics course, stuff like that. What's the strategy, and what's the business value of it? And Boeing is making a large effort to reduce the amount of seat time and moving towards the 5 moments of need, and really trying to broker information to get it to people at the moment of need, when they need it, and how to use it. So that's a monumental strategy shift that we are going through.
And maybe what might be helpful too, because we really want to help with our audience to understand, not just conceptually, what is strategy and what does it do, but what are some of the benefits you see from moving from that shift just within your organization alone? What are some of the things that you've really seen, both from the talent development, equipping, empowering to be successful front, and maybe overall as achieving your company's overall objectives?
It's the focus, really. One is there's enormous cost savings. Secondly, as we move to a more enterprise approach, where in the past, if you were out of country or maybe in India or the UK, you're kind of on your own. This is an approach that everybody has the same quality of instruction. It's done by the people who are the most qualified to do it, making sure it's aligned to an overall strategy. And it's not necessarily just packaging something, translating it, and giving it to India. It's what are the cultures, the customs that they need that will drive the most value for them. What are their business needs, given their culture may be different than someone in St. Louis or Charleston or Seattle. So I would say cost is one thing, just effectiveness is another. If you're looking to drive to a business objective, a behavioral objective, having it aligned to an overall strategy focuses ever-dwindling resources and allows you to prioritize what you're doing and when you're doing it, and how you assign resources to it.
And this is very consistent with what we're seeing too, Steve, when we look outside of not just Boeing, but as the industry as a whole. When you talk about effectiveness and efficiency, I think that is really where we see a lot of organizations turning their attention to in this current day and age. How do we both strategically and operationally find excellence in our learning and development activities? Because let's face it, you hit the nail on the hammer there. The cost of learning and development is growing. And that's actually a great transition to our next section here. What is the true cost of learning? Why do we care about the cost of learning? Well, if you look at some of the metrics that are going on right now, we find out really quickly that organizations are getting very concerned with how much learning and development activities are costing us. Just from this year alone, from ATD's State of the Industry report, there is an average of $1,273 spent annually per employee. Now, of course, this is an average, and there's going to be factors such as organizational size and organizational need. But just as an average, that's an astonishing number. It's up 1.2% over the previous year. That equates to about 37.5 hours of training that one employee goes in a year. Almost 40 hours, an entire week of formal training that an employee will go in one single year. And 45% of that is technology driven. So we use some sort of platform, some sort of technology to deliver and deploy that training to our learners. So if you think about it as a whole, think about what this actually costs the organization. It's not just the top line cost of over $1,000 per employee that we're worried about here. It's also the infrastructure we need to support to deploy the training, to those learning and development, to our talent and to the people that need to learn within our organization, and all of the maintenance and upkeep from the technology stacks that we use to support that delivery. So organizations are starting to look at this as a whole and say, what is the true cost of the learning that we're doing? And more importantly, not just what is the cost, but how do we make sure that we are getting the most out of our efforts? And this thought, and this line of thinking is pushing everybody to go more strategic than tactical, more long-term than short-term. And of course, we see that across the industry. But Steve, I think it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, based on just the ATD stats alone, how does this compare to what you see inside your organization and some of the spend and the true cost of learning that really encompass the things that you experience at Boeing?
I'd say, if anything, it's dramatically understated, and I'd say that from talking to a lot of my colleagues throughout the country and internationally. This is maybe just formal learning. When you bring a new employee in, the time to competency is critical. So if you're working on a new system and they are stuck on how to do something, maybe they don't do it the right way or the most efficient way, I would say that, the amount of time spending on Google or an internal search or going through a manual probably dwarfs that 37.5 hours. So I think that's why a lot of organizations are going to performance support. Again, brokering all that just vast information down to when you need it, where you need it, and making sure that you can efficiently do your job. So I know in our enterprise, we've aligned a lot of the different groups of mandatory training that we have, and there's been a real effort to have everybody come together and say, what is really those things that people need to take versus nice to have, for finance, for ethics, things like that we want to, have people take to make sure that if something goes wrong, we've got ourselves covered. Is it driving to a business value? And I think that's one thing that I've seen more than anything over the last 2 to 3 years is people starting to really question it, why we're doing it, what's the value of it, and how long are we taking people out of, doing their job. And you look at this, the 37.5 hours, whether you're a small company or a large organization, can you really afford to have someone out of doing their work for almost a week? So I think the costs speak for themselves, and I think that's why Boeing, in particular, our organization, is moving to reusable learning objects, moving to performance support, utilizing Conrad Gottfried's 5 moments of needs, really trying to broker that information and get it to people when they need it, where they need it, whether it's embedded into a system, and moving away from the formal training rules.
I haven't seen that personally. I've definitely seen the benefits inside of Boeing and where you're moving from that. I think would be interesting before we move to the next topic, not only to involve the audience that we have with us, I would also draw attention to some of the more non-monetary costs that learning and development really involves or invokes within an organization. What I mean by that is not just the cost that you see on the screen as far as time and resources. Oftentimes, it's the amount of effort that's needed to support the outputs of how much is spent on each employee each year, how much time it's taken to deploy the training, not just take the training by the learner, but to get the right learning in the right place to the right learner. Additionally, how do you make sure all your technology integrates and make sure that it works properly, that you have the right sort of technology in the right place that makes the learner experience more valuable versus more distracting? These type of intangibles are what we see time and time again being the things that make organizations really start to pull their hair out. How do we find strategic excellence around here when we don't quite understand how our technology integrates together to support the whole ecosystem? Where are the gaps in our learner experience? What is causing them to really be impacted along their journey? And ultimately, what is really becoming the roadblocks for them to be successful within their organization? So this all ties back to that central topic. What is the true cost of learning? And why should we start thinking strategically to start driving business value? And as Steve mentioned, you're hitting it right on the head, as I would say it too. It's to get to that efficiency and effectiveness, to make sure that what we do and the efforts that we spend really drive value for the organization. So I'm interested. I'm curious. We have a good amount of people that have joined us today as attendees. I'm interested to see what are the true costs of learning that they've seen within the organization. So let's do this. Let's get the chat box going here, and let's see what some of our attendees say. What are some of the things that you see being as the true cost of learning? Is it the monetary? Is it the tangible? Is it the intangible? What are you seeing in the industry? And we'll share it as a collective here. So we'll give them a few minutes. And Laura, as you see a few things pop up, let's throw it out there.
Sure, absolutely. And while we have people type in some of their responses, I did want to ask how you have that discussion with your stakeholders. If your stakeholders are used to asking for a Band-Aid, so to speak, and you really want to talk about a business and you want to talk about what that cost is, so to speak, when you talk about cost to stakeholders, how do you have that discussion with them so that you certainly don't scare them away? I would think that that would be a good discussion to tie in with the business results.
Ooh, that is a great question. So I have something for it, but Steve, I'll put it to you. Do you want to field that one first?
Yeah, I would say to have that conversation and make it meaningful, it has to start at the right level. It starts with leadership. People have to understand it at the right levels, then drive it down. That has worked for us as we've gone through our transformation, having at the executive council level, having them aligned, and then moving down to the vice presidents and so on and so forth. So that by the time the people who are operational have those conversations with their peers, there's alignment all the way up to the strategy level, to tie it back to why we're here. So leadership drives strategy in innumerable ways.
Fantastic. Steve, thank you. Our participants have given me some information here. So Chris has noticed that the biggest pushback that they've seen is more around the time spent away from the job, not necessarily the cost. So it's more about the time.
That's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy's mentioned that the greatest cost is the lack of immediate impact of training or the poor knowledge and training transfer. Catherine mentioned. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll later on that one a little bit.
Yeah.
We had for a while, I worked at another company, and we had people who would continually come and say, "Look, we won this award. We won this award." And I would come back. I was in customer engagement and business development, and okay, so what did that do to help my salespeople bring in new business? I'm glad you won an award, but did it need any, what's the business value to me in sales that this is done, right? So yeah, if it's not driving to a business objective or business value, and training for training really has literally no value.
Absolutely, absolutely, and go ahead.
Laura, if you don't mind too, I'm going to Chris's point there. I think that was a fabulous comment there about the conversations around it. Do you mind repeating what that first comment was by Chris?
Sure. It was the biggest pushback is more around the time spent away from the job, not necessarily the cost.
I think that is an absolute amazing thing to bring up, because what I see holistically across the organization is this realization that formal learning and performance support are not the same thing. Anybody familiar with Conrad Goffreson and Bob Mosher's 5 Moments in Need will have a good idea around what I'm talking about here. And I highly recommend anybody who may not be familiar with it, it's a good read. And it helps really conceptualize the idea of this formal learning and performance support infrastructure. But to Chris's point here, what I think a lot of corporations are realizing isn't the best approach is to focus on the formal learning side. And formal learning, just quickly, because this could be an entire webinar in and of itself, really centers around how do we equip and empower the workforce with the skills that they're not already expected to have. And that's where a lot of that formal training and formal learning comes in. I would wager, personally, from what I've seen both personally and professionally, that a majority of corporations' work don't sit in the formal learning space. Most of our workers already have the skills. They need to just hone it in the direction the organization needs to hone it in and build upon those skills and capabilities. That puts it in performance support. And performance support is generally, and I do use generally liberally here, generally on the job or during the moments of need while performing. So I think that is a very good point to bring up. It is a hard discussion to have. And I would also say that there's hired this topic around how do we shift the idea from moving away from more formal learning to supporting people at their moment of need. With that being said, Laura, please, let's ask the next question. Let's ask, we have enough time here. Let's go to the next question that they asked.
Sure, absolutely. So Catherine mentions a couple things. She mentions that it's so important to ensure that you create a connection, and it's a lot of effort to create that connection. And certainly with reporting and analytics as well, that's always a challenge as far as in when you talk about the true cost of learning, you also have to talk about how long it takes for people to create reports and to analyze that as well.
That's another great point there. The only thing I could contribute to that particular comment is connecting it to, from what I see, it's best, if this is a good tip or maybe a best practice, connecting it to the language of the people we are talking to. I think one of the challenges a lot of the learning development practitioners have, from my experience, and this isn't everybody, so this isn't a combination of our industry. I think our industry is making huge strides here, but is speaking in the language of the business and not in the language of learning and development. So when we make that connections, we need to make sure we're connecting in a way just like we would with our audience profiles and say, we are going to translate this in ways that the people we are talking to understand it, can connect with, and can really internalize. Say one more. Have another one? Oh, please, Steve, yes.
I was just going to add, too, I mean, facts and data help, and cognitively, there's a lot of data out there that says sitting in a class for 40 hours, your retention isn't that great, and your ability to go back and utilize what you've learned in that 40 hours in a, instructor-led training is not the best way, most efficient way, or the most cost-effective way, to impart that knowledge or behavioral objective.
Absolutely. Oh, and Steve, I have a question for you from Matt. Matt asks, how are you increasing productivity by embedding real behavioral change?
Good question. So we have changed the way that we identify and do our upfront analysis. And we really are focusing, what it is we're trying to do. We have behavioral objectives now identified, mapped out. During our analysis, we have much more. We've reorganized all the job roles in our learning organization. We've really concentrated on getting a lot of people with performance need analysis type of skills up front to really have those upfront conversations and really drive out what it is that the customer is trying to do, what's the business objective or behavioral objective that they're coming to us for. Then we've also stood up, we had metrics, analytics, but it was kind of people doing it off the side of their desks. We stood up a new team with professionals with experience in that area so that we can really follow up, do the analysis of did it have impact, did it have the impact that we thought it would have, that the customer expected, and we're really closing the loop on that. Baselining what we've done and then using that as a continual feedback for improvement. It sounds easy, it sounds like things we should always have been doing, but there's just almost a laser sharp focus on that now.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
And thank you, Laura, and also thank everybody else for their contributions here. Wish we could take more, but in the interest of time, I'll circle back here and say, really, why are we even talking about the true cost of learning? And why is this, and how does this connect back to thinking strategically and building good strategies to drive business value? Really comes down to the bottom line. The bottom line is this: learning and development prices are continuing to rise. It's costing us more and more to equip and empower our workforces to be successful for a variety of reasons. New technology, new approaches, new needs, higher competencies, higher speed to competencies. There's a lot of reasons that really contribute to why that cost continues to rise. But really what organizations are starting to shift their focus on, and Steve, please correct me if I'm wrong here or add and contribute as you see fit, the price of learning is becoming less important to the return on investment, or as the Phillips model would say, return on expectations, as in what we see coming back, what our learners are capable of doing, how much learning is actually transferred, and more important, how much impact we see to performance that drives business value.
Yeah, performance and behavior. It's having that conversation. It's being able to go back and say, okay, did we reduce the amount of injuries? Did we increase the cycle time on something? Did we have less ethical violations? And this is not just Boeing centric, but across. So in the holy grail of learning is can you paint a clear line between what you spend and what your results are. If you align it to a strategy and to a higher level, rather than one individual piece of training to one individual, business objective that we're trying to get to, if you align it to a strategy, I think it's been easier for us to focus on higher level value, and I think those conversations have starting to become a little easier. Also having, again, I'll go back to leadership driving strategy or enabling strategy, is that when you have top level leaders engaged, all on the same page, those conversations are happening at that level, and it makes it more valuable and easier to have those conversations all the way down the chain because you're aligned with leadership and strategy, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, then let's think about this. Let's start shifting our conversation here towards the backside of our presentation here. So we're talking about how to build strategies. Well, the first step usually when people talk to us about this is we're going from an idea here of we're going to build strategies. What does that mean to our organization? Usually the first conversation that I've seen is talking about the difference between thinking strategically and thinking tactically. And again, not as a condemnation as the industry. I think the challenge that the industry is experiencing, the learning and development industry is experiencing over time, is really moving away from helping the organization develop and employ tactics to solve training needs to thinking more strategically to solve business needs. And it's not really learning and development's fault as a whole that they're seeing this. Really, a lot of organizations still view learning and development as a transactional component of the organization, the training producers, the people that are going to develop those beautiful PowerPoints that are going to help everybody be amazing employees. Realistically, what we're seeing more organizations realize is equipping and empowering talent is the means to a huge end. And that huge end is a workforce that is not only prepared to be successful, but is also encouraged, supported. They keep talent. They reduce turnover. They help their workforce be more capable as a whole because they start understanding the value of what that competitive advantage is for the organization of having a workforce that is truly supported both formally and through performance support within the organization. And to do that, we really talk about moving from tactical to strategic thinking. So let's talk about thinking tactically. Putting it very, very succinctly, forgive me as I trip over my tongue there for a second. Putting it very succinctly, tactically is really the means, what we're doing to get to the end. Strategy is the end, what we're trying to accomplish for the organization. So if you think about it from this sense, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out where we're trying to go versus what we're trying to do. And to give a little bit of comparison between the two, think about it this way. Strategic thinking is really about decision making that is made to solve a problem, not a symptom. A tactical thinking or a tactical approach would be more about what is the symptom we're doing and how can we relieve it. Strategic would be what is causing that symptom and how do we eliminate it. On the same side, efforts are focused on long-term gains and success when we think strategically. What is the long play? And that's important because sometimes we'll take a short-term loss if it means long-term win, and that is a strategic play. Tactically, on the other side, says we need to figure out what is right in front of us and how to overcome this objective right now without considering what's beyond that. Strategically, on the other hand, too, you start thinking about the broader picture. Where is the organization going as a whole? What does talent need to be capable of, not today and tomorrow, but in the long term? How do we get our organization to continue to be strategically and operationally successful moving forward versus focusing on the immediate need and getting wrapped up on what's going on now? Also, what I really enjoy about strategic thinking over tactical thinking is the flexibility component. In this day and age, environmental factors, business factors, organizational factors, if you would, and personnel factors change daily, globally. And that's introduced because of new technology, new people, change in the markets, change in the environments. We experience a tremendous amount of disruptors in the workforce. And strategies and strategic thinkings are meant to be persistent over time. They're meant to be flexible over the long term. So as the business evolves, the strategies don't become obsolete. And that is a big difference from thinking tactically because tactics can change moment to moment. And more importantly, and unfortunately, what we see is tactics often become obsolete even before we start to employ them. So that's from our side. Steve, I'd love your contribution from what you see internally from your experience between the difference between strategic and tactical thinking.
So as I think about the different companies I've worked for, Ray, and I'm going to go back and pick at what you said earlier a little bit, the learning organization and what we do, aligning to an overall talent development strategy, should be and needs to be a competitive advantage. If leadership thinks it's just a cost burden rather than a competitive advantage, that's a paradigm that needs to shift to get the most out of the most value out of your training organization. So thinking strategically, like you said, the long term, how can we use it to a competitive advantage? Everything should be viewed kind of that realm. Can we do it? Can we get people to perform better? When people come in, starting with onboarding, onboarding should be a competitive advantage. We're going to get people in. We're going to introduce them to the culture. We're going to have the time to competency be negligible as it can be. Then overall, how do we want to move people through time and with learning? So, what's our strategy around that? What's our strategy for learning both domestically and internationally? How can we align that? I think those are conversations that have to start at the top, but also can't just go down one or two layers and kind of fizzle out at the bottom. It's got to be that strategy has to be aligned throughout the workforce. Hopefully, I answered your question.
Yeah, I think that was a great contribution, but I think that's a good point. Why don't we pause for a second and start seeing what questions we might arise? Because the next part of the presentation is a really fun part. We get to talk about 7 tips to build strategies that drive business value, and I really enjoy that component of it. But before we do that, let's see what questions we've sparked within the attendees for the panel. So Laura, what kind of questions are people bringing up?
Yeah, I do have one question, and I think it piggybacks off of what Steve just said. Was the question about what is the key to engage that top-level management? And I do have actually a more a pointed question, and maybe these work together. Strategically thinking, what is Boeing implementing to capture organizational knowledge? Knowing 65% of Boeing workforce is retiring in the next 3 years. Strategically thinking what Boeing is implementing to capture, let's see, oh, that was just a repeat. So let me ask this as kind of a double question. The first question is, what is that key to engage that top level management? So I know, Steve, you're talking about really making sure that strategy, is tied across the board, right? And I'm sure that that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I would also say that how learning and training is viewed by executives and our executive council, our CEO and chairman of the board, has evolved. In the past it was part of HR, so we may have had, our last 2 VPs were engineers, for example, with no real background in it. It was just, something HR had to do, and it was a cost burden, right? Our new VP now, who reports up to a senior VP who's on the executive council, has a long background in learning and training, and
sure,
she's worked at all levels, now as a VP. So her approach is dramatically different than it was before. It's not just about managing costs anymore. It is really trying to align the entire enterprise, build that one Boeing learning ecosystem, having a coherent learning strategy. Who's going to do what? What's the overall cost across the enterprise? Realizing that we have so many different locations, so many different products and services, but that's okay. It still can align to our overall learning strategy. So that answered a little bit. I would say just to how training is viewed, and then flipping it so instead of just a cost burden, it is a competitive advantage. And then I know a lot of people are leaving. In our organization, we went through a massive transformation. Like I said, a lot of new job roles. We have a very formal knowledge management group with some pretty good tools. Most of them are homegrown, as well as learning scientists that are helping with that. We have performance needs analysis people that are going out whether it's manufacturing, engineering, finance, whatever, trying to help out those transitions. And as people are coming in, they're only staying a year or two, so it's incumbent, not only do we onboard them, get them to competency, but also capture what they know and what they do so that we can pass that on to the next person.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Steve.
You know what? I think I'll contribute too, as somebody who works as a partner to where Steve at and helps organizations get to that point. I think really when it gets down to it it depends first off on the perspective of the CEO, the C-suite in general. How do they view learning and development? I think that's the starting point before you talk about how you talk to them, how do you get them on board. Do they view learning and development as a tactical advantage, as in this is going to help us get training out to the organization, or do they think it as a strategic business partner who's ultimately going to help the organization meet its goals? And depending on how that first pulses with the organization, that modifies the approach that I would recommend people take to start having those conversations to help the senior leadership, to help other parts of the organization look at learning and development as a as a strategic component of the business versus just as potentially as a production warehouse. So if you have an organization that doesn't see the value of learning and development, I usually recommend helping them to see that value. Start speaking their language, start talking in the terms of operations. These efforts impact these kind of performance metrics. These are the KPIs that we're trying to shift. These are the type of costs and burns that we're doing. Here's the strategic inefficiencies that we are seeing. Here's what we're trying to overall accomplish to meet the Q3, Q4, 2019 goals, or whatever the case may be, instead of these are the learning things that we're trying to accomplish, per se. If they're already on board, as in they already see the value of learning and development, then you start talking about blending in and working, having those conversations and looking them not as departments, but breaking those silos around the different parts of the organization, making friends with operations, making friends with marketing, making friends with business development and the other aspects of the organization, and really understanding what needs drive them. So the conversation now starts revolving around how learning and development and talent support integrates with the business at their points of need to really drive value, making it much more about what the business needs and how you get them there from a conceptual big picture versus, hey, what can we do for you? And those are some of the many tactics that we recommend approaching when it starts talking about getting C-suite involved there. So hopefully that adds a little bit to the question.
I'm sorry, Ray. I would say also one of the things we've done too is we have recognized that, it's a huge change management effort as well as culture. So we've rolled in an organization devoted to culture and organizational capability so that they can weigh in with how we do it because there are so many different locations and cultures. And we want to make sure, strategically, the culture that we want to build and maintain is aligned with our overall learning strategy and as we go through and develop and implement the strategy.
Absolutely great contributions as well. All right, I think just for the interest of time, we're going to hit into the 7 tips. We do have another question and answer time at the end here. So Laura, if there's some really good questions, there's the ones we haven't addressed. Let's go ahead and hold on to those and we'll try to address them as much as we can with the remaining time on the back side of this presentation. With that being said, let's hit, what are the 7 tips? So when we were brought to the table to say, hey, how can we help this organization, or how can we start thinking more strategically or more conceptually, what are the things we can do to make sure that the strategic planning efforts have the maximum impact? Came up with these 7 ideas, these 7 tips to build strategies that drive really business value. And each one, some of these start as a little high levels, things that might make sense. So we'll add a little bit of why these tips exist as we go forward. With that being said, let's hit the first tip. The number 1 tip we usually always give to the people we work with here is you got to know what your strategy really tries to do. And to really clear up what that statement means, I love the analogy of the doctor versus the pharmacist. As a learning and development professional, as a talent practitioner, as a business partner within the organization, are you the doctor or are you the pharmacist? Is your strategy meant to solve the symptom or the root cause? A doctor wants to know what causes the headache. What are the underlying issues contributing to the headache? And how do we prescribe a course of action to resolve said issue? The pharmacist, on the other hand, will hear headache and give you aspirin. The headache may go away, but more than likely it will come back. So the first tip is know what your strategy is really trying to do. Are you trying to build a strategy around being a doctor? Are you trying to build a strategy around what is the root cause that are really contributing to the problems of the opportunity the organization is trying to resolve? Or are we really going after the symptoms? Are we really looking at only the symptoms of the issue? With that, I'll pass over to you, Steve, for your perspectives on tip number 1. Did we lose you, Steve? We might have got you on mute, if that's the case.
Okay, sorry, I was that person talking on mute. I think
Don't worry.
You have to know what your strategy is. You have to know where the sweet spots, where the value is in your value chain, right? One of the things we did when we transformed is we really concentrated on what are those things that will give us a competitive advantage, and what are those things that we do, content curation and what have you, that are really high value, knowing that some of those things traditionally, like ISDs, can kind of the more tactical stuff can maybe be sourced and done, and we could free up our headspace for our folks to be more strategic and really concentrate on that higher value stuff, align it to overall strategy. So getting that strategy in place, aligning it, and then even aligning the job roles to it from a value perspective is something that we found to be very valuable.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I completely agree. It's really getting to that point of what is the value you're driving? What are you trying to do? And that's what the strategy should be built around. And then also make sure that the strategies that are built for the organization, regardless of what the strategy is, whether it's a sweeping enterprise learning strategy and how the organization as a whole approaches learning and development, over to more specific, prescriptive learning strategy around how are we going to solve the onboarding issue. We really conceptually know what we're trying to get at, and we have a good starting point. Which leads us to tip number 2. This is a great tip, and it sounds simple, but I can't convey how many times that this very tip has been extremely helpful to organizations as they think about strategies. Because oftentimes what happens is we think we know what we want, and we start developing a solution before really realizing where we are, which is why we have tip 2. Know where you are before you decide on where you're going. Because if you don't understand the landscape that you're operating in currently, and what I mean by understand is if you don't really take in consideration all of the factors and contribution leading to your current state, it makes it very difficult to figure out where you're going or how to get to where you're going. It's like trying to get to Europe via car from Texas. You got to realize that you're starting from Texas, and we got to figure out how to get there more efficiently and in the best way possible. Steve, I will kick over to you for your perspective.
I would say this is important because oftentimes the learning organization and the people who staff that learning organization are very insular and maybe just have contact with subject matter experts and maybe aren't integrated to the populace of the company at large. So I would say that I have found in working through different companies over time was that the learning organization may not know where they are, how they're viewed, and the efficacy of their the content they put out. So taking a really hard check, listening to your customers, from their perspective, because they're going to tell you if what you're producing is of value to them or not, and if it's making a difference. So having those hard conversations and be willing to listen, to know where you are is critical if you're going to start moving towards the overall strategy.
Outstanding. So if we're going to talk about knowing where people are, the next one, I know, Steve, you're going to love this one as well. I know we've had some really good conversations around this particular tip as well. But if you know where you are and where you're going, here's the next biggest issue that I think organizations face when trying to when trying to develop and involve strategies. And that's really knowing what target they're shooting at. What we mean by knowing what target you're shooting at, what objective you're going for, it's really about being crystal clear on your goals and objectives. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen organizations shift that target. And what I mean by shift that target is if we think about it, how many times are we trying to work strategically towards a goal only to find out that what we thought we were going towards has now shifted to another priority, has now shifted to another objective, has now shifted to another goal. So up front, When you reach that starting line, when you know where you are, the best tip that we can say at this point is know what target you're aiming on with crystal clear clarity. So everybody is aligned to that central purpose, that central goal, that central set of objectives that really refine and define the goal the organization is trying to go to. With that, I'll pass to you, Steve.
And being crystal clear, also having a culture and a change management component for your goals and objectives is critical. Otherwise, leadership can be on board, but if there's not transparency and there's not alignment and it's very carefully planned out, then the people who have to operationalize it are going to be confused. The other thing is having strong leadership, because when the rubber meets the road and the real change starts, it's easy to give in to expediency in the heat of the moment, getting stuff done and make sure none of the plates drop and break, right? So having that strong leadership, having a really good plan, addressing the culture and change management are critical components of achieving your goals and objectives, I would say.
You had a really good point there too. Thank you for bringing it up. When we're not crystal clear on our goals and objectives, the people that actually have to do the work, the people that actually have to operationalize the components of the strategy that make it what it is, the approach as we would, their effort can start to go all over the board. And really, it's not their fault, because at this point, they're only operating with the goal that they have in mind, the target that they have been presented with, which, if it is not clearly identified, could be a completely different target than what the organization wants as a whole. And why does this happen? Nobody does this on purpose. I've never walked into an organization and said, wow, you guys are trying to make them do something different than everybody else. What usually happens is everybody's trying to do to the best of their ability what they can do to drive success. And it's more about the fact that there isn't a clear overarching picture of what's going on, or in contrast, the people closest to the strategy have the picture in their mind, and it isn't conveyed, if you would, well to the rest of the people that have to deal with it. So I come into a strategy late. Steve's been working on it for the last 6 months. I don't have the same picture in mind that he has. So if I can't quickly link up with that goal and objective, what I understand of it may be vastly different than what Steve and his team may understand of it. So again, thank you for those contributions, Steve. Let's move over to the fourth tip here. This one is a personal favorite of mine. Make sure your decisions are based on evidence and data, evidence-based approaches. Oftentimes we walk in and say, we really want this. We're either enamored with a certain capability, a certain function, a certain technology, a certain idea that we put in our mind that something will be great for an organization, and we'll look at it. Whether you're walking through a vendor booth at a huge conference and you see an amazing new LMS or a new learning platform, or you're going out and you see the great things at gamification and LMS administration and anything that's out there that really catches our eye at the time, we get enamored by it because they're out there for a reason. They bring great capabilities and they bring exciting new potentials to the organization. But will they work for the organization? Will they work for the strategies that are in place? Will they work with the ecosystem that currently resides within the organization? So when building a strategy, decisions need to be evidence-based. How are we making the decision to execute? More importantly, how are we making the decision to build an approach that will give us success? And by approach, I mean the strategy, the plan of action needs to be supported with a roadmap of how we're going to do it. And that roadmap of how we're going to do it should be based on the evidence. Steve, your thoughts?
I'll go back to something you said earlier, Ray. When you have the strategy and you have the components, can you articulate it in the language the business can understand and really articulate what the value is of what you're doing it? So, hey, I need X millions of dollars to bring out this really cool new stuff. Is it tied to your informal learning strategy? Is it part of your asynchronous learning strategy? What's it going to give? How's it going to benefit the business? I think then having the evidence and data, the facts and data there to bolster your claim is going to help. But I think clearly being able to articulate value with the evidence and data to support it is going to get you a lot further with your business partners than just going and saying, look at this, isn't this cool? Look at all the awards I won.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we make these evidence-based decisions, if we're saying we're going to make decisions, we're going to build approach that really takes in consideration the unique circumstances of the organization where we want to go, the next tip really hits on how we start to build that approach. And the fifth tip is very much about start with the big picture. What I typically see happen, or what I would caution against happening, is that we immediately want to start thinking about what can we do from a very ground level? How do we get into the weeds of this and solve this problem? The problem with getting in the weeds comes back to a very famous statement, is can you see the forest for the trees? Can you see your surrounding for what's in front of you? Can you see the mountain in front of the shadow at your toes? There's so many different ways you can look at this, but the moral of it is the same way. If you're thinking strategically, you have to think of the end game. And the end game is the big picture. What are you driving towards? What are you trying to do? And then back into how you're going to get there. So think big picture first. What is the overall roadmap? We want to get to Albuquerque. This is how we're going to do it. And then start thinking about all the pit stops, the places you're going to get gas, where you're going to get food, the type of vehicles, where you're going to stop to sleep at the night, the sites that you want to see along the way, how much time you want it to take. All of those tactical measures should go after you figure out the big picture of where you want to go, because that will make sure that all of the tactical measures supporting the strategy are aligned to the big picture. It is immensely difficult to do it the other way around, where you pull together a bunch of disparate tactics or tactics that could be disparate into a big picture. Usually that approach ends up with a Frankenstein strategy of a bunch of tactic hodgepodge together towards a hopeful goal. Steve, your thoughts? We may have you on mute again.
Sorry. It starts with a top-level strategy, whether it's a talent strategy. What are those capabilities that are going to let you, that supports that strategy? You know, what are the processes and tools that will support the different capabilities you need to enable the strategy to be implemented? You know, and there's different levels too. You know, for us, Ray, as you well know, we went to a reusable learning object. We completely different way of thinking about content development rather than the 100% customization that we used to do, where we just, you know, go to our customers and ask them if they like it supersized. That was a strategy, and it's still a difficult conversation with some of our customers. And we really have to concentrate on having those conversations, making sure they understand why we went that route. You know, because they're asking, well, last year I could go to Jill, and I said, this is what I need, and then I got it. Now you're telling me, you know, we're only going to do it this way. It seems to be very restrictive. Well, our strategy is, you know, as we go along and build up that library, reusable learning objects, we can publish it in multiple modalities, and instead of a 6, 12, 18, 6-month-long development cycle, we can get something out to you very quickly with much lower costs, and then, or maybe bend it a little bit and then get it out to you. So the value to you is you'll have it quicker, you'll have it lower cost, and you know you'll be able to deploy it right away. Big picture, you've got to be able to articulate it, and it's got to align. Yeah, and I know I keep going back, but having been through this, it's just, you know, not being able, for people not being able to see see the WIFM in it for them is one of the pitfalls to developing a strategy. And as you go down the chain, where it gets kind of fragmented and where expediency starts taking over, and it may not be fully committed to, and employees may not be fully engaged in executing it.
Absolutely. So look at the time here. I want to make sure we get our last 2 tips out to the group here. So I'll go straight into the 6th tip. That was absolutely fantastic, Steve. Thank you for those contributions. The 6th tip here is really the approach is only the beginning. And really I can summarize this with the statement, what you are going to do is not as important as how you are going to do it. And that might sound counterintuitive to what we've been talking about. We're talking about thinking strategically, thinking big picture, and then supporting it with tactics. But the approach is only the roadmap. Then you have to start figuring out the logistics behind it. You're going to have to figure out how you're going to support that plan so that it's operationable, so it's actionable, so you can actually make the strategy live and breathe. And that's very, very important, because you have to build strategies, or we recommend that strategies are built around the idea that they're successful. And that seems intuitive, but they have to be executable to be successful at this point. And that's how do we accomplish that in the strategy? Well, you start thinking about not only the approach, but what does that mean for roles and responsibilities? What does that mean for logistics support? What does this mean for the long term and the 3, 6, 9, 12-month plan of sustaining this? What does this mean for maintenance and future success? And how do we measure that success in the future? All these considerations should be brought to the forefront when developing the strategy and thought up front versus waiting towards the end. And I'll pass to you, Steve, for your thoughts.
I think you covered it, Ray. In the interest of time, let's just keep going.
Perfect. All right. And the 7th and final tip: no plan will survive without good logistics and leadership. Every plan that's built strategically should have some sort of roles and responsibilities, a RACI, if you will, that identifies who the stakeholders are, and not just the stakeholders, but the people who are going to be the cheerleaders, the people that are going to be the supporters, the people that are going to be the drivers, the people that are going to be the influencers for the strategy. If that isn't identified up front, often what we find is a strategy sits on the shelf, even a really good one, because nobody can take it and move it forward. There's no sense of accountability to the strategy, and there's no link to the broader goals of the organization through leadership and management support. So the 7th and final tip: figure out what logistics you need, but more importantly, figure out what leadership and leadership responsibilities will be engaged in that project. And then with that, that wraps up our 7 tips on how to build an effective strategy that really drives towards business value, making sure that what we do works towards it. So we have a few minutes here, and I'm going to go straight into the questions. So let's take a few minutes here to answer any question that our attendees might have, and then I'll pass it back over to you, Laura.
All right, I'm just going to give our attendees a few minutes. In the meantime, I just want to mention that certainly you've learned a lot about the the strategy and the 7 tips or the 7 steps. And also want to talk about the fact that Cavio provides capability experience in 4 core service areas to drive performance in organizations. Strategic learning consulting is certainly one of them, along with execution support, learning and performance solutions, and learning technologies. So certainly reach out to us if you have any questions. I have no questions from our attendees at this point, Ray. So
all right. Well, I'll take that as a very positive thing. So let me say thank you to all our attendees.
I do have one.
Ooh, we got one. Please send it on over.
Can you elaborate on the point that that you just made before about what needs drive the business? In regards to leadership,
quite catch that last question.
Yeah, so it has to do with about what type of needs drive the business. Meaning, ultimately, you know, you have to have a plan in place to build that strategy, right? So in that strategy, it needs to be something that helps to drive the business. And can you elaborate on that point as far as if you do have certainly a strategy and it helps to drive the business? Maybe what are those, not necessarily what are those benefits, but in the long term, how does that help that strategy?
Ooh, this is a good question, a big one. So I'll try to be very succinct with that and say that most of what we can do to drive business value is you have to figure out what the business exists for a purpose. The business is a system that has a purpose, and that purpose doesn't mean it will stay the same over time. So what is the business trying to do that makes it unique, that makes it successful, that makes it grow? Strategy should be aligned with whatever supports that idea, whether it's talent development, equipping, empowering, performance support, training and development. Those capabilities ultimately should be made in the mind of supporting where the business is going and where the business needs to be successful. Because without the business, let's face it, learning and development is a moot point. The most equipped and empowered workforce is meaningless in the face of an organization that no longer exists. So again, that's what we mean by linking the efforts to the needs of the business and where we're going. And I'll give one last thing here too. I know we're short on time, but it means that if you're making decisions, they shouldn't be inhibitors to the business. You shouldn't be adding inefficiencies or ineffectiveness to the business. It should really be a force multiplier for it.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, it is at 11 o'clock, so very quickly want to mention the July webinar. It is the learning effect with an A. Yes, we do mean that. And it's focusing on millennials and how companies continue to look for ways to effectively engage and inspire the new era of workers. And certainly this continues to cost companies money, time, and so we want to have a little discussion around how learning and development holds the keys to developing the millennials and that millennial culture, and focusing on being productive, engaged, and high-value contributors. So that's on July 10th, and our presenter is Jeff Carpenter, our CEO and founder of Cavio Learning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If there was any questions that come through the panel that we missed, we will address those separately, and you will be receiving an email within the next 24 hours with a link to this session recording. Thank you for your time today. Ray and Steve, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us. Thank you. Please reach out to us as the slide shows here. And Steve, thank you again for your time today. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Have a great day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.